Hi everyone, and welcome to this podcast dedicated to the impact of a positive productivity shock. Suppose that before the shock, the economy is at its long-term equilibrium. The equilibrium is non-valuation in a context of imperfect competition. There are real rigidities on the goods market, where the firm is in a situation of monopolistic competition, and on the labor market, where the negotiated real wage is fixed at gamma. For this real wage, the labor supply is higher than the demand, so there still is some persisting unemployment in the long term. The state of technology is measured in our model by a factor A, which we find in the production function y equals AF of n. A expresses an exogenous level of productivity, and any increase in this factor will lead to an increase in production. It makes sense, right? In this case, workers are more productive, so they produce more. So, if there is a positive productivity shock on the economy, the productivity increases, which we express using the expression dA higher than 0. If A increases, the production function is modified. With the same quantity of labor, the firm can produce more. So the curve representing the production function shifts to the right or upwards. Under the new technical constraints, the profit maximization behavior of the firm will lead to an increase in the labor demand for any level of real wage. It makes sense as well. The firm has an incentive to use more of a factor that's become more efficient. The labor demand shifts in the direction of an increase in N. Be careful here. The graph is upside down. If you look at it in the right way, it actually shifts to the right. Again, in the direction of an increase in N. Let's analyze what happens in the short term. Remember that prices and wages are fixed, so the production adjusts to the demand through quantities and not through prices. The economy is still at the real wage gamma. Compared to the initial situation, the labor demand increases because labor is more productive. This level of labor demand is, of course, the labor demand of a firm that is not constrained by the effective demand. To this level of labor demand corresponds a supply of goods, YS short term, determined through the new technical constraints obtained after the shock. This YS is higher than the initial level of production in the economy. The production has no effect on the demand of goods. So YD remains at the initial level of production Y0. We therefore have a disequilibrium on the goods market. The supply is higher than the demand. Firms, being constrained by the effective demand, must scale down their production plans. So, in the end, the short-term production level has not changed compared to the initial long-term equilibrium because the demand did not change. Graphically, nothing happens in the plane YR as IS, LM, and BB are not impacted by the shock, and the interest rate also remains unchanged. For the same level of production, as workers are more productive, the firm needs less workers. So employment decreases compared to the initial situation. Overall, in the short term, technical progress is likely to increase unemployment. However, this conclusion will change in the medium and in the long term. In the medium term, prices become flexible while the nominal wage remains fixed. The short-term equilibrium was hiding an excess supply of goods, which will push firms to decrease their prices in order to maximize their profits. The decrease in prices has two effects. One, the supply decreases because the real wage increases. And two, the demand increases through the indirect channel of the interest rate. The firm sets the price that maximizes its profits, and from that, we obtain the equilibrium price that equalizes supply and demand. Using the price, we can then deduce the equilibrium level of production. Graphically, the decrease in P shifts LM to the right. We see that the Y in medium term is higher than the Y in the short term and than the initial Y, while the interest rate is lower. Because the production increased, if we didn't have a shock on technology, we would have concluded that employment also increases, as we did with the previous shocks that we've been dealing with. Indeed, at constant level of technology, firms need more people to produce more. Here it's different. The workers became more productive. So the firm can produce more with the same number of workers. So we actually don't know if the number of workers will increase or decrease compared to the initial situation. In the graph that you see here, we observe an increase in employment in the medium term, and medium term is higher than N0. This means that the increase in production in the medium term was large enough to trigger an increase in employment despite the higher productivity of workers. Note that the firm reintegrates its new labor demand curve to its profit maximization program, and that some persisting unemployment remains in this economy characterized by imperfect competition. This case of increasing employment in the medium term compared to initially, let's call it case 1, is the most frequent case. This means that technical progress has a positive impact on employment already in the medium term. Even if case 1 is the most frequent, there exists a second case showing a level of employment in the medium term still lower than initially. This is the case that you see on the graph here. medium term Y increases less than in the previous case. And so the firm produces more than before the shock, but with less workers. These workers being more productive, and the increase in production being less large than in case 1, the firm needs less workers than in the initial situation. Employment increases compared to the short term, but it decreases compared to the initial situation. This case, let's call it case 2, is less frequent in real life, but still possible. Let's now go to the long term. We are representing here what happens in case 1, but the reasoning would be the exact same for case 2. In the medium term, prices decreased, which means that the real wage became higher than the negotiated real wage. Or, in other words, W bar over P became higher than gamma. In the long term, the nominal wage becomes flexible. It decreases, which will trigger a downward wage price spiral, which ends when the real wage comes back to the initial negotiated gamma. When we're there, be careful. We do not come back to the initial level of employment, as we had seen in the case of a demand shock, for instance. In this case, the labor demand curve changed, and the firm would like to use more of these more efficient workers. So the firm hires more people and produces more. Employment and production are therefore higher than at the initial equilibrium. The economy reaches the level of employment and production that the firm had expressed in the short term, but that was not possible to achieve because of nominal rigidities. In other words, Y long term equals YS short term. The decrease in prices shifts LM to the right and triggers a decrease in the interest rate. We are in imperfect competition, so there still is some persisting unemployment, but less than in the short term. So in the long term, we cannot say that technical progress generates more unemployment. It's actually the opposite. In the long term, technical progress creates jobs. This shows a fundamental difference in our model between demand shocks and supply shocks. With demand shocks, the economy returns to its original level of output and employment, while with a supply shock, the variables N and Y are permanently modified. Overall, we can say that the effects of technical progress spread in the economy through the decrease in prices that we observe in the medium term at first, and then again through the decrease in prices that we observe in the long term. We can represent the effect of the shock in the plane YP. Right after the shock, the supply of goods YS increases for any given level of real wage. The quasi-supply curve shifts to the right. In the short term, however, the increase in productivity has no impact on the demand. And the short-term equilibrium is the same as the initial equilibrium. Yet, this short-term equilibrium was hiding an excess supply of goods. And we see that the firm is located outside of its supply curve. It does not maximize its profit. This excess supply triggers a decrease in prices in the medium term, which will have two effects. It will decrease the supply of goods and increase the demand of goods through the indirect channel of the interest rate. We reach a medium-term equilibrium with lower prices than in the short term and higher output. In the long term, because the real wage became higher than the negotiated real wage, the nominal wage decreases and the curve YS pivots to the right. The increase in W and the downward wage price spiral lead to a long-term equilibrium with lower prices and higher output than at the initial equilibrium, thanks to the technical progress. One thing to note, though, up to now, we assumed that the negotiated real wage did not vary between the initial situation and the final situation. In other words, we assumed that gamma remained the same before and after the shock. This means that we assume that the negotiated real wage was not indexed on productivity gains. This assumption is very strong because the share of productivity gains in real life is likely to benefit partly to the workers and to allow for an increase in the negotiated real wage. The level of indexation would obviously affect our conclusions on the impact of the shock on prices and outputs.